اقتصاد مزدهر. محورين من محاور الرؤية الثلاثة التي انطلق منها برنامج تطوير القطاع المالي، مرتكزاً على أهدافه الأساسية التي تقوم على تمكين المؤسسات المالية من دعم نمو القطاع الخاص وتطوير سوق مالية متقدمة وتمكين التخطيط لبناء وتعزيز ثقافة الادخار المالي. ولكي يحقق البرنامج أهدافه، أعلن عن 42 مبادرة محورية تشمل تطوير كافة جوانب القطاع، كما أطلق شركاء البرنامج برعاية كريمة من خادم الحرمين الشريفين مؤتمر القطاع المالي في نسخته الأولى عام 2019، ليكون القبة التي يجتمع تحتها صناع القرار والتنفيذيين الماليين من مختلف المؤسسات محلياً وعالمياً على مدى يومين، وتحت شعار آفاق مالية واعدة. 6 محاور أساسية تم استعراضها خلال 21 جلسة نقاش شارك فيها أكثر من 80 متحدثاً محلياً وإقليمياً ودولياً بحضور أكثر من 3000 شخص. صاحب المؤتمر في نسخته الأولى زخم إعلامي كبير من مختلف وسائل الإعلام محلياً وإقليمياً وعالمياً، وتصدرت موضوعاته عناوين الصحف الأولى، كما حظي افتتاحه وجلساته بالنقل المباشر على مختلف القنوات والمنصات وحسابات التواصل الاجتماعي. توجت مخرجات المؤتمر بالعديد من التوصيات التي من شأنها تطوير القطاع المالي وتذليل العقبات والتحديات والمساهمة في بناء اقتصاد وطني متين وتنويع مصادر الدخل وتحفيز الادخار والتمويل والاستثمار. أوقفت جائحة كورونا العالم، لكن السعودية لم تتوقف، وذلك بفضل عزم قيادتها ومرونة سياستها المالية ومتانة اقتصادها وقوة بنيتها التحتية وحداثة أنظمة المدفوعات الرقمية التي مكنتها من عبور تلك المرحلة بأمان، حيث استطاعت السعودية التغلب على هذه الجائحة والتخفيف من آثارها الاقتصادية المباشرة وغير المباشرة. تمكنت المملكة أيضاً خلال فترة الجائحة من قيادة قمة العشرين باقتدار، وتفردت بتقديم أعلى المساعدات على مستوى العالم. ونظراً لمتانة القطاع المالي السعودي واستناداً للنجاحات التي حققها مؤتمر القطاع في نسخة الأولى ومواكبة للتحديات والمتغيرات، يطلق شركاء البرنامج حوارات مؤتمر القطاع المالي التي تشكل فرصة لالتقاء الخبراء والمختصين وصناع القرار الماليين من مختلف دول العالم لمناقشة أهم القضايا المالية والاقتصادية وما يؤثر عليها وكيفية المساهمة في خلق اقتصادات مستدامة، حيث يتحضر الحدث المالي الأضخم في منطقة الشرق الأوسط لإطلاق دورته الجديدة قريباً. وسيواصل المؤتمر خلال دورته الثانية تسليط الضوء على أهم المستجدات في القطاع والتي تعنى بتطوير وابتكار المنتجات التمويلية والتأمينية وطرح المزيد من الحلول والبرامج الادخارية وتعميق مفهوم المالية والإسلامية ومستجدات أنظمة المدفوعات والتقنيات الرقمية. كما يستعرض المؤتمر جانباً من التحديات التي يمكن التصدي لها من بناء اقتصادات مستدامة قادرة على مواجهة مختلف الأزمات.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Your Excellencies, distinguished speakers and delegates, my name is Rima Al-Mudaris from the Saudi Ministry of Finance, and I am delighted to be your host in today's event. We would like to extend our warm welcome to everyone who is joining us today, whether it being virtually or physically, at the Financial Sector Conference talks in Riyadh. Today's talk is dedicated to the theme of environmental, social, and corporate governance, which is very much gaining momentum rapidly and globally. This event is being organized as part of a series of focus events that leads up to the main financial sector conference, which actually takes place every 2 years in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The talks cover pressing issues related to finance, bringing together experts from all over the world with the aim of discussing economic changes in the financial sector. Just to provide you with a quick rundown of the event, we can look forward to hearing the perspectives of leaders of key organizations in the financial sector and two exciting panel discussions ahead of us. The first will focus on the opportunities and challenges of the ESG ecosystem in Saudi Arabia, where the second one will take us through the new investment landscape when it comes to ESG capital markets. Before we begin, we appreciate, as always, following the COVID precautions within the venue. We will have live interpretation from English to Arabic on ground on your seats, and appreciate, as always, keeping your phones on mute. With that being said, allow me to welcome on the stage His Excellency Dr. Fahad Al-Mubarak, Governor of the Saudi Central Bank, to deliver the keynote speech of the event. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته وأسعد الله صباحكم جميعا. أنا سعيد جدا أن أشارك في المؤتمر الثاني لقطاع التطوير المالي، وهو برنامج من أهم البرامج لرؤية 2030، والتي ولله الحمد حققت كثير خلال السنوات الماضية، وإن شاء الله أكثر في السنوات القادمة. أعتذر لكم حيث طلب مني المنظمون أن تكون الكلمة باللغة الإنجليزية لكي يشارك معنا مجموعة أكبر من حول العالم والحاضرين هنا. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Financial Sector Conference Talk Series, a sequence of dialogues that discusses the most pressing issues related to finance, bringing together experts from all over the world. The FSC talk aimed to discuss current and future changes, as well as local, regional, and global challenges to the financial sector. Today's edition, our talk will focus on the topic of sustainability. This is a very relevant topic through which we can improve the quality of our lives, protect our ecosystem, and preserve the world's natural resources for the future generations to come. We will also focus on the corporate world and discuss issues related to the three pillars of corporate sustainability: the environment, social, and governance, known as the ESG. That said, great efforts have been made so far to improve global sustainability, but the truth is, significant challenges remain ahead of us. This calls for more attention and engagement, not only from the government, but also from the private sector, to overcome those challenges and achieve the global UN 2030 sustainability goals. Although the ESG practice have proven their long-term value creation, much more work is yet to be done. Today, we are fortunate to have a list of experts and scholars on the subject of ESG, and I thank them all in advance for their contribution to this important topic. Today's talk are an opportunity for us to discuss ESG's both opportunities and challenges in Saudi Arabia, the region, and the world. We will also present the efforts made so far and encourage further participation from both public and private sector to accelerate the work of ESG and on sustainable development. For instance, one of the main challenges we face today is the lack of comparability of ESG matrices, disclosure framework, rating, and investment approaches, which makes it difficult for investors to make an optimal investment decision. Our approach must look at issuers as well as investors and all financial intermediaries in between, such as rating agencies, indices, asset managers, institutional investors, while at the same time leveraging existing international, regional, and local approaches and practice. In addition, our approach must also be holistic in the sense that it looks at the full life cycle of the organization's operation. This is important, in particular for environment pillar, where we need to adopt measures, indicators, matrices, and approaches that capture the concept of circular concept of emission when preparing ESG or sustainability reporting. Dear guests, on this note, let me take the opportunity to turn to an important topic, which is climate change challenges. Here, I would like to remind ourselves that climate change poses a real threat to our economy, economic growth, financial stability, and the profitability and resilience of corporates in the long term. Indeed, climate change and the transition to a lower rate of greenhouse gases emission, it creates both risk and opportunities to the financial sector and the economy at large. Therefore, financial institutions that do not put in place frameworks to measure, monitor, and manage climate-related risk would face major valuation challenges on the climate-sensitive assets they own caused by environmental shifts. I firmly believe that public leadership is crucial to trigger the required change and make sure the critical investment happen, public and private investment, when efficient and accountable, can pave the way for economic development and sustainability. It is therefore important that each country to take part in the fight against climate change while taking into consideration its own level of development, market maturity, structure, and its own financial systems. In Saudi Arabia, as His Royal Highness the Crown Prince as part of the Saudi Vision 2030 said, we are a leading global oil producer, are fully aware of our share of responsibility in advancing the fight against the climate crisis. In fact, Saudi Arabia is already engaging in global efforts to combat climate change challenges. Last year, when Saudi Arabia was leading the G20, the concept of circular carbon economy was endorsed by both the G20 ministers of environment and climate and energy, as well as by the G20 leaders, which is a testimony of the importance of this concept. Circular carbon economy is a holistic approach to combat climate change challenges. It comprises of 4 R's related to greenhouses emission: reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. It is a comprehensive approach to manage carbon emission. On that subject, Saudi Arabia has launched the ambitious Saudi Green Initiative with an agenda tackling multiple climate change risks, one of which is to eliminate 130 million tons of carbon emission using clean carbon technology. Finally, I would like to note that addressing our global environmental challenges such as climate change, air and water pollution, biodiversity, and ocean degradation has become even more critical now as countries seek to rebuild their economies and enhance resilience against the future shocks such as the recent one, the COVID-19 pandemic. Let us fully engage with a sense of urgency, purpose, and accountability. take decisive steps to accelerate ESG awareness and practice to achieve the UN 2030 Global Sustainability Goal. Thank you all for participation, and I wish you a productive and informative day. Together, we can do it, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your insightful remarks. Now we will turn to our first panel discussion under the title Saudi Arabia's ESG Ecosystem, Opportunities and Challenges. It is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Jaime Sanz as the session moderator. Mr. Sanz is the Managing Director and the Head of the Sovereign Advisory of Societe Generale, who will take us through this addition to introducing our esteemed speakers. Please welcome on the stage Mr. Sanz and his esteemed speakers. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello, welcome everyone. I am absolutely delighted to be here today, and I want to thank the Financial Sector Development Program partners for the opportunity first to travel again to the kingdom and to the region and to see our friends and partners for the first time in a very long time. That by itself is a great pleasure for me, but especially for organizing this event around the topic of ESG. The ESG topic, which I don't think I exaggerate if I say that as recently as 2-3 years ago, ESG was a fairly exotic topic in capital markets and maybe in the global economy. A few of us were talking about it already, but generally was considered something that you could live without. I also don't exaggerate if I say that in the course of these last 2-3 years, it has actually become the topic of every conversation in capital markets, the topic of every conversation around the global economy. It has come from obliviousness to absolute centrality in the discussion. And certainly in the capital markets and in financial markets, where we expect we had a boom year in 2020 in terms of green and sustainable financing. And we expect this year to be as much as double in terms of green financing as it was last year, approaching probably $1 trillion in green and sustainable issuance in 2021. But certainly it's not just a topic that relates to capital markets and financing. It's a topic that relates to the global economy, to everything that every country and every corporation does nowadays, from defining the global political agenda to all the global key topics on migration policies, labor policies, indeed the energy transition, sustainability in general. So it's absolutely central to every discussion. But with this sort of explosion in attention to the ESG topic, obviously, there are some challenges as well. And I will mention, maybe summarize what I see as the challenges, and maybe the panelists will find a way to address some of these issues during the panel. What I see as maybe the three big challenges of the ESG topic. The first one is measuring. I think with the explosion of the topic, we've gone to a world where we have literally thousands of indicators and hundreds of entities and organizations putting out indicators to measure, to evaluate the quality of ESG for a particular corporate, for a particular financial institution, for a particular sovereign. Obviously, that's not good enough. We need to filter. We need to make sure that the data that we're looking at is coherent, that is consistent across countries or across corporations. We need to make sure that it's relevant data. We don't want to get lost in a lot of details, which at the end of the day are not particularly material. So measuring is one key challenge, I think. The second key challenge, I would say, is implementation. Because obviously, with the attention that the topic is getting around the world, I cannot think of a single corporate, a single financial institution, a single sovereign who is not putting in place a program to address ESG, to address the environmental transition, to address social topics, to address governance. However, obviously there is some space between putting a program out and implementing it. And I think the devil will be in the details, as we say, and we need to make sure that every institution that implements an ESG program is able to put it in place, to execute it, and that everyone who's interested in the evolution of this topic can monitor that execution is happening. This is a big challenge for everyone. And it requires, in addition, for example, from a point of view of the kingdom and the sovereign entity, it requires coordination among different entities. It requires coordination between the different line ministries. It requires coordination between central government and local authorities, coordination between the government and multilateral institutions who are very central to this discussion, such as the United Nations or the World Bank or the IMF. It requires coordination between governments and private sector. So that is the second challenge. And the third challenge, just briefly, is the ability to communicate properly. Again, it's going to be difficult for stakeholders in the ESG world to understand and assess to what extent these programs, these activities, these actions are being implemented effectively, whether they're having the impact that is expected of them. So communicating for every entity in this room will be very important to make sure that you are communicating properly what is being done, what has been achieved, what has not been achieved, and why. So just those are maybe the three topics that I think the three challenges that I think we will encounter as we jump into this fantastic pool of ESG, sustainability journeys, and energy transition, etc. Without further ado, I think I will introduce the panel, or just with a very general question. I have been told that you have all been given a very detailed sort of package with the biographies of all the panelists, so that I don't need to introduce them. But I have to say I found one item in the very impressive biography of His Excellency El Kuwais, which I thought I had to mention, which is that both of us are alumni of the New York University Stern School of Business. I feel very proud to be in the panel with you for that reason alone. Now, in just as a general sort of introduction to the topic, I want to hear from each of you, how does this ESG new world touch your organizations? In particular, when it comes to the Capital Market Authority, what is the role of the CMA in promoting sustainable finance and in helping, therefore, the transition to a green economy?
Thank you very much, Jaime, and welcome back to Saudi Arabia. It's nice to see you back out and about and traveling, and welcome to everyone. It's nice to see everyone in this beautiful gathering. Well, if we talk about the capital market in general, the capital market really sits at the intersection of the interests of issuers of securities who have projects that they want invested and investors who have excess capital to invest. In that interaction, it's important that the market takes into account all relevant, and I think the word used was materiality, is anything that is material in making the investment decision. And in that regard, it is increasingly becoming apparent to us that investors consider sustainability very material in making investment decisions. And I must say, we've come a long way. You mentioned NYU. Indeed, in NYU and in most business school 10, 15 years ago, it was almost anathema to consider or to propose that businesses were accountable to anything other than their shareholders. We've come a long way since this. Possibly the reason for this is we're seeing an increasing role in corporations and the private sector in general, in economies and in society at large. And with this increasing role, it is paramount to have a more nuanced, a more comprehensive view of the role of these corporations and on who they're accountable for. And I must say, we have seen great strides in local corporates reacting to this. So if I can give it an example, of the largest 10 companies by market cap in the Saudi market, already 6 of the 10 incorporate some degree of sustainability reporting in their reporting cycle. Now, this is all elective. So companies are doing this, A, recognizing their responsibility, and B, reacting to investor demands for what they see. Now, with respect to regulators and where we get involved, we generally get involved in areas where there's high degree of consensus. And if I can give an example, governance. Governance is an area where standardization is very clear. And when standardization is very clear, it's easy to intervene in regulations. It's very clear what good governance looks like. Good governance is very similar from market to market. And that is why we intervened with regulations, incorporating the Corporate Governance Code. And the Corporate Governance Code now applies to all companies listed in the Saudi market. As a result, we've seen the ranking of corporations increase significantly. If we then move to other areas, we find quite a bit of variability from investors on what they consider material information. So if I take one example on sustainability of labor relations, a local investor would look at localization, labor localization, Saudization, as a very pertinent factor. An international investor would look at very different metrics. And our role as a regulator is try to reach that level of consistency, that level of consensus, and once a consensus is reached, then we can start intervening with regulations. Our expectation is this will not be a binary issue. In other words, we incorporate all sustainability reporting or nothing, but it's probably going to be a more gradual approach, where once consensus is reached on any specific measure, that's when we start to move it to fall under the purview of regulations.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting topics already there. One, I just pick up briefly on the last comment that you mentioned. Indeed, this is a journey. It's not a destination. We work with a lot of entities who expect to be in a destination very quickly. I think this is a process of gradual achievement of goals, and there's a long journey ahead, and every step taken is worth something. Just to continue maybe with the introductory comments, now Mr. Hani Al-Metaini, who's CEO of the National Debt Management Center. How does the ESG world touch your organization? What is the role that you play when it comes to ESG development?
Thank you very much, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Hello everyone. I would like to start with one of the main National Debt Management Center mandates, which is front-facing the investors, not only in the domestic market, but internationally at the global level as well. It's part of our communication, our promoting to the Kingdom credit story as well, to promote for the KSA story to those investors. I remember in June 2019, during our Eurodeal roadshow led by Fahd Saif by that time, we have received this specific question on the ESG for the first time, and since then it became one of the main topics, center of focus for our credit story, to ensure the alignment between the vision of the Kingdom in 2030 and ESG principles to those investors. On the other hand, from funding strategies as well, we have what we call the medium-term debt strategy, MTDS, which talks basically on one simple concept, which is ensuring market accessibility to the government at all times at fair price by expanding the investor base. The investor base since 2015 and even before was extremely limited to 5-7 conventional banks by that time due to one simple fact that government papers were conventional. So the DMO by that time took the initiative to introduce the Sukuk program to expand the investor base domestically. Of course, the primary dealership system, etc., with the support of Your Excellency at the CMA and SAMBA as well, have reached a decent, I would say, level when it comes to diversification of the investment. Internationally, accessing the USD denominated, then Yaruru. Now we have the ESG. Yes, it is part of our investor expansion, but definitely not this is the only reason for that. The main reason why we are shifting toward this direction, because basically it fits us. It fits our vision, and we will come into that in details. It's a natural choice for the kingdom, and in all means, our flag is green, so definitely we have to go green all the way.
The NDMC plays a big role in this aspect of communicating to the outside world the achievements that the kingdom is having on the ESG topic, because as we all know, investors are very demanding and they are very pressing, and I do remember that particular roadshow in 2019 and how the topic jumped up to relevance, not just for the kingdom, but in general for every issuer. All of a sudden, and I'm not talking about green bonds or sustainable bonds, conventional funding exercises, the ESG topic was taking a lot of relevance in every discussion. Now, Engineer Fahad Al-Ajlan, President of the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, CAPSARC, I think you bring a very unique perspective to the panel, and obviously the kingdom being a large hydrocarbon economy. How does what you do, how has it changed over the last year or 2 years to incorporate the energy transition, the green transition?
First, let me thank you for having me on this esteemed panel. At King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, we've been set up more than a decade ago, and the aim is to enable policy-based dialogue that is focused or based on fact-based research. As you can see from the name of the center, energy and energy transition is a big topic that we're looking at and evaluating, especially impact on climate change. And anything we discuss today when it comes to energy and energy transition, climate and climate change is a part of the discussion. I think when we look at ESG as a research organization, we look at it from 2 ways. First is, what is the financing that is required to enable the energy transition over the next few decades? And I think that's where we're not doing so well today. When we talk about green bonds and green financing, we're talking less than 1%. And if we're looking at the magnitude of investment, we're talking in the hundreds of trillions to achieve the desired energy transition that's consistent with the Paris Agreement. We're talking about having to grow multiple times to get there. Also, the focus and the concentration of green finance is with developed economies. However, the need for financing is mostly within the developing economies. Countries like China, India, and Saudi Arabia, where they're still growing from an energy point of view, still need more green financing when it comes to financing the projects. The second part is risk. How do we deal with risk? And I think that is a big discussion, what assets are under risk. And for example, when we look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in the majority of scenarios that they look and assess to get to net zero path to being in accordance with Paris Climate Agreement, we still see fossil fuel and hydrocarbons playing and supplying a majority of the energy resources in the next 20 to 30 years. And so for us, when we're talking about stranded assets and assets at risk, we need to have a holistic definition of what we're talking about. When we try as a researcher to study ESG and try to come up with research, as His Excellency Mr. Mohammed Igwais indicated, the taxonomy is very different. What I talk about when I talk about ESG is very different from the guy sitting next to me when they talk about ESG. So standardization is very important. That would help in addressing the change that we would like to see in increasing the amount. I think on the energy transition, specifically in Saudi, I think there have been very impressive progress so far. I think in the latest article for consultation with the IMF, they compared Saudi Arabia versus the rest of the G20, and emissions between 2015 and 2019 fell by 3%, compared for the G20 as an average increased by 2%. If we look at the developing economies of the G20, that comparison would be even more impressive. And I think this was, a very structured approach for government policy that focused on energy efficiency, effective price reform, while, protecting the vulnerable population at risk and the segment of society at risk. And so going forward, when we're talking about energy transition, Saudi has a very ambitious plans. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince unveiled a 2030 target of having, 50% of the energy mix for the electricity and electrical grid to be from renewable, which is very, on par with, the US, the new administration plans. When we're talking about the EU as a whole, they're talking about 35%, and it will be different depending on each country. But I think Saudi Arabia is very invested in that, moving with the energy transition and being part of the energy transition, while, developing the circular carbon economy, which is a holistic framework that, understand and that, pragmatic answers are needed, especially when it comes to having, fossil fuel be part of the energy mix going forward, and how do we address the emissions that are coming from through, a natural carbon cycle.
Indeed, thank you very much. Thank you for your concise and clear introductions. One topic that Mr. Al-Aslan mentions, we discussed at the beginning, is consistency of data, standardization of the data, making sure that we're comparing apples to apples when we're talking about how different organizations, including sovereigns, comply or don't comply with ESG statistics. We have seen a fair bit of controversy already in the lack of consistency of some of the private measurement of ESG compliance, even on some of the multilateral organizations. So that's one challenge for the future. Maybe let's get into a bit more detail now of sort of the building blocks of the ESG discussion and the ESG challenge in a country like the Kingdom. Maybe starting with Mr. Al-Medaini, I think one of the big challenges is aligning local programs such as Vision 2030 with international goals, such as, for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Clearly, the Kingdom has done quite a bit on that front. Maybe you can start telling us what do you think have been the biggest achievements in this aligning and in meeting the SDG goals?
Thank you very much for these questions, which come to the core of this panel. You called the challenges, I called it beauty. When we align the or ESG principles, UN Sustainable Development Goals, to our vision. Let's focus on our vision first. Our vision based on 3 simple pillars. Vibrant society, thriving economy, ambitious nations. By design, by nature, it is aligned with ESG principles, and if allow me some time, because it's a wide answer. The factor E, environmental, we cannot talk about it without mentioning the initiative that His Excellency the Governor just mentioned regarding the Saudi Green Initiatives, which is based on 4 main factors: diversifying the energy mix, cutting carbon emissions, rehabilitating and greening land, and increase the protected areas. These strategies, albeit they are new, they have been acknowledged by the IMF that GSG in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has been reduced by 3% in 2020 as compared to an increase or average increase among the G20 nations by 2%. This is in 2020. Also, it has been mentioned regarding the energy mix, the target to shift the energy mix to be 50% renewable by 2030. The IMF also acknowledges the fact that the Saudi Arabia government will invest up to $50 billion by 2030. On waterfront, 2020 budget as well, funded number of projects related to the drinking sources, where the coverage rate increased to 83%, as well as the water sanitation, which is increased to 57% as well. All of these factors related to the E factor only. Now, if you go to the S, for instance, the social, we cannot start talking about it without mentioning the SDG, or the Sustainable Development Goal number 5, gender equality. Today, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia enjoys more than 33% female participation in the labor force, as compared to 20%, or less than 20% by 2017. Senior positions, example, Shura Council, 20% female participation. Us, at the National Debt Management Center, we are enjoying over 30%. The ladies are over there. Even I'm sure, Your Excellency, at CMA or any other governmental institution, SAMA, your government, and the private sector as well, definitely. Not only that, but SDG number 3 and 4 related to good health, quality of education. And we can speak day and night about the Kingdom efforts in containing COVID-19 situation, but unfortunately, I don't have the time to have all the time. I will just talk about the number of cases, 15,000 cases per 1 million for the Kingdom, to be exact, 15.4, as compared to 48 plus in G20. Vaccinations, I stopped counting, but I believe it exceeded the 63 to 70% for the 2 doses. So we are moving fine in that front. Education, number 1 improver among the G20 nations. In fact, actually in the 2021 budget statement on the expenditure side, 990 billion Saudi riyal total expenditures. Let's say 1 trillion, and my colleague here, Asir Khan, is looking at me for the budget. 40% is that were allocated to the health, education, and social development. This shows the Kingdom's commitments toward the social aspect within ESG principles. Last but not least, and sorry for taking so long, the governance. And we have, the first thing to look at is the World Bank governance indicator. 18.9, almost 19 points improvement for the Kingdom. Control of corruption indicator as well, 12.4 points increase. Unprecedented reforms when it comes to the laws, courts. We have the commercial court, the personal status law, and the civil transition law. All of these, and I apologize to throw all of these information, but are just samples of how the Kingdom is aligned within its vision 2030 to ESG principles and the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much for the exhaustive list of achievements. Going back briefly to that 2019 roadshow that you mentioned, I think we got the impression that perhaps the investor community was not entirely up to speed on the developments that were going on already in the Kingdom. As I mentioned before, this is a journey. We are nowhere near the destination, but I think in a very dynamic environment, a lot of things have been done already that have not maybe been reflected by some of the stakeholders, the investor community. Again, looking at the consistency of the data, I think a lot of the data, unfortunately, is backward-looking, and therefore is not capturing things that are going on today, things that have been going on in 2020 even. So thank you for bringing us up to speed. Maybe let's focus a little bit on the topic of green finance. And starting with His Excellency, what is the experience so far with green finance, and what are the lessons learned?
Well, if I may, I'll just pick up on what my friend and colleague Fahd said in his introduction, and I'll try to provide a one-word experience, and the experience in 4 words, and then maybe some background. The one-word experience is new. The experience with green financing is very new. If I were to provide a 4-word experience, it would be new, but rapidly evolving. and maybe I can provide some background. If we look at green financing is really a subset of debt capital market financing from our standpoint. And debt capital market financing is already quite new in Saudi Arabia. So if I can give an example, in 2020, debt issuances by the private sector, maybe my colleague Hani talked about the public sector issuances, private sector issuances reached 30 billion riyals. That is already a over 230% growth from issuances in 2019. Now already, although we're starting from a very low base, we're starting to see a proportion of green financing. And I think in 2020, it was roughly about 6%, which was green financing. I agree with my colleague Fahad that this is nowhere near enough, especially if we look at the initiatives that Saudi Arabia is planning and the investment and financing needs that they require. Our expectation is that this is likely to grow, driven by three factors. One is the growth in the debt capital market itself, which is likely to continue. The second is opening the door to international investors. And today, international investors can participate in the local debt capital market exactly on the same terms as local investors. And the third is, of course, the big aspiration and the big investment requirements with respect to green projects and sustainable projects. So I go back to my initial description, new, small, but rapidly evolving.
Very clear, thank you. Mr. Metaini, I don't know if you want to add anything. By the way, if you have anything to add on each other's comments, feel free. I think it's more dynamic. But if you have any additional comments on green funding and green finance.
Definitely. I'm respecting, that's why I didn't interrupt, but thank you for allowing the time. Definitely, the green financing, actually we have started the green financing back in 2020 with the first ECA transaction for King Abdulaziz transportation project as part of our initiative to reduce the carbon emissions, which is classified under that file. Definitely, this is just a start for a journey to come. We have announced recently that we have hired banks as well to help and support us in structuring ESG framework to be part of our issuance program going forward within the domestic market or international as well. We are hoping to be launched very soon. With further details, definitely will come to the market regarding the details of that structure and strategy of the sustainable strategy as well.
Okay. Yes, indeed, very fast developing market. I think globally, green financing market is growing strongly. Yet, I think we're still probably around the 5% mark globally also when it comes to green financing versus overall capital market activity. Maybe focusing a little bit on the energy transition and energy financing to Mr. Al-Achlan. What is needed, in your opinion, to achieve this transition, and what kind of calendar or timetable are we looking at?
So I think over the next 10 years, I mean, in the past few years, we've seen a very focused effort on energy efficiency just to enable a lot of the reform that followed. And so when you have a standard for people that want to select the best appliance or the best AC or the best car, from an efficiency point of view, that helps them when you're doing energy price reform. Now we're moving into a very different, at a corporate and at a, government level investment. So you're seeing a big part of the renewable pipeline that we're seeing. My friend Patty here have so many projects that I think they're keeping them busy. But this is just a start. Today, we're talking about growing, renewable to be 50% of the energy mix. That's a huge and ambitious target, and it requires a lot of investment from green finance, but also typical finance, because I'm not sure if green finance will be able to rapidly accommodate all of the projects that are happening within Saudi. But I think we need to focus on making sure that perfect is the enemy of the good. The US was able to reduce their emission by 20 to 30% in the power sector just by switching from coal to gas. And even though that was not a renewable investment, for me, I would think this is a great green investment that would help in achieving the targets of the Paris Climate Agreement and getting to the 1.5 degree to 2 degrees, scenario. And so we need to focus on a lot of these, incremental effort, that these are not, the perfect solution, but they're good enough solution, and they get you to an area where then you can actually invest more and get to the desired, destination. As you mentioned, we're talking about a transition that will span decades. And so it's very difficult to have an outlook that will span decades, 3-4 decades in advance. And so it's very important that we work with the current constraint. Today, we cannot go to 100% renewable electricity. I mean, we're seeing in countries and different episodes where this issue of reliable access to energy is becoming, whether it's in the EU or what we've seen in Texas. And again, renewable is not the only problem there. It was, different factors, but renewable is part of them. And so for us, if we want to have an energy transition that's not volatile, that's not going, to have protest or not going to impact investors and bottom line, and not have, assets, that are impacted similar to what we have seen in COVID, it's very important that we manage this process, that this is an orderly transition. It's not volatile. And it's very difficult for organizations to plan, this transition if prices of energy are going up and down significantly. I think everybody would like to, and everybody here is aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement. Saudi was actually one of the first few countries to ratify the Paris Climate Agreement. And so I think we're wholeheartedly going toward that direction. However, it's not something that will happen within 5 or 10 years. It's going to span multiple decades. But I think there are ambitious plans over the next, 10 years that we're going to see. I think COVID, despite, happening, Saudi was able to switch, 10 million typical electricity meter, to switch them to smart meter that, give residents and citizens control over how they, their energy access, their electricity bill, how they can optimize. And it opened a lot of dimensions when it comes to, to reducing loads and helping in managing the grid load that will help, incorporate more renewable and greener energy sources. But I think what is important is to understand, that perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think we should be very focused on what is good and what gets us there in an orderly and smooth way.
Okay, very clear, thank you. It's a complex but very critical transition. Is His Excellency, is the regulatory framework fully in place to facilitate this transition?
Well, I think it differs by activity. So, for example, I'll give you one particular example. One of the biggest drivers of financing, at least as it relates to the capital market, is what we call the offer of securities regulation. And until quite recently, the regulations were heavily tilted to the investor protection side at the expense of facilitating financing. And I think the delicate balancing act needs to be struck. And I think that delicate balancing act was revised starting in 2017 with the rewriting of a lot of the offering securities regulations, which really made it easier for companies and all issuers to raise capital. And we've actually started to see the results of this, whether it's in equity raisings. Today, we have possibly the largest number of companies in queue to list than at any time since the establishment of the CMA. We're also seeing this on the debt side, where we talked about a little bit of the requirements. But regulations is not the only factor. We're seeing a good tailwind from liquidity in the market. So whether we look at liquidity in the capital market or liquidity in the economy overall, and liquidity globally, which means that liquidity can flow as a direct proportion of the amount of projects that we have and the feasibility of those projects. And that's the journey that we're just now starting.
Thank you. Without that doubt, this is a collective effort. This is a national effort. Everybody has to push in the same direction. I'm being told that we're running out of time. Time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? So maybe we can take a few questions from the audience. There's a microphone.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Khalid Al-Masri, Credit Agricole CIB. So perhaps a question directed more to the NDMC, Mr. Hani. So you obviously touched on green, you touched on a few things, diversifying obviously your issuer base, one of the core mandates obviously of NDMC, to bring in obviously more and more investors into your programs. So you talked a lot about green bonds, you mentioned green ECA. Wondering your plans going forward. Obviously, we're aware from public sources that you're talking to obviously some banks on certain projects. A lot about green, a lot about bonds. How about other, social aspects, perhaps other financing instruments? You touched on ECA. Obviously, green bonds are the bellwether. That's everyone sees them. It's in the news. You can look it up. It's easy. But there are, I'm sure, other thoughts in your head. You're very obviously hyper-active NDMC, so happy to hear what you can disclose publicly, I think, to us.
Thank you very much. The hyperactive is for the team, not for myself. So I thank the team. I take this opportunity to thank them. For your questions, you're absolutely right. We are more focused as a strategical move going forward. I mean, bonds became so easy, very straightforward. What we are looking is to continue our mandate in providing the government with innovative funding solutions, such as the one you have mentioned, ECA. Why we need to focus on that? For one simple reason, not only to diversify the investor base, but to diversify the funding channels, which is more important. Having more funding channels means you have more type of investors. So definitely, yes. Going forward, the focus will be on other alternative financing, if I may call, such as the ECA. I can imagine it not only in the medium term, but in the short term as well. More focus and priority will be on such funding channels in line with our usual bonds and sukuk issuances. Thank you very much.
Any additional questions?
Hi, my name is Mohammed Al-Muhazi from the NDMC. I just have one question. I have one question to Mr. Fahad Al-Ajlan. For the renewable sector energy, does the investment come directly from the government, or the government will facilitate the sector and private sector will take the lead? And thank you.
So in most of the projects, it's usually private developers that will undertake the project. The government will just commit to an offtake. And that has been a very successful model and has actually helped in lowering the cost significantly. And so all of these projects will be based on a 20 or 25 years offtake from those private developers, who will then be able, or they would seek green financing among other types of financing for these projects.
We can take another question if there is one.
Very interesting dialogue. I enjoyed myself really well. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Samir with Al-Marai, Head of Sustainability. We have been our journey on ESG for the last few years, and thankfully we are ranked #1 on Tadawul by ESG Invest. One question we have, obviously we want to stay where we are, we want to continue the journey. We understand there's going to be tremendous competition on ESG field, which is the right thing to happen. One project that we want to accomplish is to continue our solar energy and the renewable energy sort of targets. Rather than having multiple solar panel plants in multiple locations, it's always advisable to have one big plants and then sort of put the electricity on the grid and use that energy elsewhere within our operation. So net metering, we understand, is not quite allowed in Saudi Arabia. And I wonder if there has been any progress on allowing that to facilitate us to sort of go big on our renewable energy sort of dreams. Thank you.
So, as I understand, last year or beginning of this year, the Water and Electricity Authority actually has established new rules talking about net metering and some feed-in tariffs. The problem is in Saudi is that if you're looking at utility scale projects, the cost of renewable is very low. And so it makes much more sense from a public policy point of view to focus on these, utility scale projects that would then help you because of their low cost to penetrate the energy mix for electricity. But there is, I think, a feed-in tariff that has been agreed. I'm not sure if it would actually encourage or incentivize a lot of, private, or, citizen to actually install solar panels on their roof beyond their use. However, I think there is a website, I can't remember the name of the website, that you can actually look at and you can calculate how much you would save and the return on investment. It's more geared toward, private citizens who want to install in their housing. But it could be, I think the rules applies to all, provider. And there has been a recent reform now, so the establishment of the principal buyer who would buy in all the electricity, and it will be, based on some kind of establishing a market mechanism to get all the renewable, but also non-renewable energy to the grid.
Hi, this is Raya Chalabi from Reuters. Just two quick questions today. The first is from Mr. Al-Midani. When do you expect we may see a first domestic green bond, and how green will it be?
As green as our flag. This is the short answer. Actually, as I have mentioned earlier, we have assigned the banks to support us in structuring the ESG framework. I cannot provide a specific date, but definitely it will be very soon. I can mention 2022 as a long target, if not before. This is definitely will be subject to all market conditions, ETC, and the funding plan for the government for next year.
Thank you. And the second question is for Your Excellency, Mr. Al-Kuwiz. How many more Tadawul listings do you expect for this year?
I wish I could answer as green as our flag, because that's a good answer. Quite a few, actually. So if we look at the numbers today, we have over 50 files that are either offering or listing, either in the primary market or the Tadawul market. Our expectation is obviously this is subject to market norms and the readiness of these businesses, but we imagine that we will end the year with over 30 listings.
Okay, unfortunately, I think we've come to the end of the session. Luckily, there's a second session where many of these topics will be discussed again in detail. I want to thank again the Capital Markets Authority, the Ministry of Finance, the Saudi Monetary Authority, Mr. Aslan and Kapsark for participating, for organizing this timely event. This is the beginning of a journey, and raising awareness around this topic is not going to be too much. I think we need to continue to raise awareness and to discuss these topics. Thank you very much for the audience participating today as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to our distinguished speakers. I think we can all agree that this was a very insightful session. I believe now we will have a 30 minutes coffee break. We will convene back here at 12:45, please, if you may. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, welcome to our second panel. I am Jean-Marc Mercier, Vice Chairman, Capital Markets at HSBC, and I have the immense pleasure to be back in Riyadh this week. And thank you for having me today for the Financial Sector Conference. Let me introduce our distinguished panelists. I'll start with Paulina Kurdiavko, Partner and Senior PM, Head of Emerging Markets Fixed Income Investment Team at Blue Bay Asset Management, an $80 billion fixed income asset manager based in London and owned by Royal Bank of Canada. Timothy Jolin, on my left, Head of ESG Development and Advocacy, Amundi, Europe's largest asset manager. Manish Manchandia, Group CFO of Saudi Electric Company, the largest electricity utility in the Middle East. And Paddy Padmanathan, President and CEO of Aqua Power, a proud Saudi company that is leading energy transition globally. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, COVID-19 accelerated the reassessment of the relationship that capital markets have with society, placing sustainability increasingly at the core. Such profound change is evidenced in HSBC's 5th annual survey globally of 2,000 issuers and investors that was released just 10 days ago. And obviously in July, before it was released, but after the survey was conducted, we saw July was the hottest month on Earth since the records began. So globally, 93% of issuers and 84% of investors have increased their attention to environmental issues, social issues, or both. 51% believe that paying attention to these issues can help improve returns or reduce risk. And here in the region, half of the issuers polled say climate change is already affecting their business or activities, up from 7% a year before. Again, in the region, 2/3 of the issuers say they expect their company to actively seek advice on green, social, or sustainability issues in relation to capital markets transactions in the next 12 months. I can see the kingdom embracing sustainability. We heard from the first panel. So Aqua Power has been the first to achieve green loan certification from the Climate Bond Initiative, CBI, and close the first green certified project financing in the GCC a few years back. Saudi Electric Company brought the first green dollar sukuk just last year from the kingdom. And I can also mention the Ministry of Finance and the NDMC for a green ECA loan. We heard that. The Red Sea Development Company doing a SAR green loan. The Islamic Development Bank. Apicorp has recently published its green financing framework. The NDMC, we heard from Hani Al-Hamedi, it's working on a sustainable financing framework. And I understand the PIF has picked 5 banks to work on its own sustainable financing strategy. So let me ask my first question to Paulina. The global sustainable debt market has seen the last year a huge growth, actually almost doubling in size. We are probably on course to reach 1 trillion full year 2021. So how is Blue Bay Asset Management looking at this opportunity?
Jean-Marc, thank you for your question. And I would like to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here as well. It is my first post-COVID trip to emerging market country, and it is not a coincidence that it happened to be an ESG conference, which just underlines the importance of this topic for us as investors. It's true that the growth of ESG-linked issuance has been quite astonishing. In fact, in emerging markets already today, 20% of year-to-date global EM issuance is done through ESG-linked instruments. And I would not be surprised if a few years from now, majority of all debt issuance in emerging markets will be issued through an ESG-linked instrument. With that in mind, it's important to remember that there are some key differences when it comes to assessing ESG risks for us as investors in emerging markets compared to developed world. Well, firstly, we cannot address ESG concerns without engaging emerging markets, as they account for over 50% of global GDP, and this share will only continue to grow. Secondly, when we look at ESG risks in emerging markets, we have to acknowledge that the starting point is generally lower compared to developed world. Over 50% of EM countries would be ranked as very high or high risk when it comes to fundamental ESG assessment. Hence, our focus is very much on engaging with the issuers, both on corporate and sovereign side, to see if we can note the improving trend and if we can articulate the trend to our clients. And the reason why I mentioned that is because when we think about the growth of ESG-linked issuance, while we're very excited to see this development, when we talk about this to our clients, we always have to combine it with the underlying ESG risk of the issuer itself, not only focus on the ESG-linked issuance. And the most powerful combination for us is when we can put together the format with the bigger, longer-term ESG objective of the issuer. That's where our clients are willing to compromise returns in order to invest both in the ESG-linked instruments and in the country or corporate that is actually improving.
Thank you, Paulina. And if I turn to Patty, you were the first, I believe, in the region when you did your CBI project certification. Do you want to walk us through the lesson learned, what happened then, and why did you choose that path?
No, thank you very much. Delighted to be here. Thank you for including me. We had, it was quite an experience starting sort of 4 years ago when we worked on that. one of the things that we learned, somewhat exactly what Poliana already pointed out, it was about not only the project itself, it was also a huge amount of scrutiny on us, our own principles around environmental stewardship, our own sort of social responsibility parameters, and how we were looking at governance. All of that needed to come together. It was a very straightforward project from a project perspective. It was the Dubai solar plant that was to deliver electricity, solar energy, 24 hours a day. It was a very large project. It was $4.3 billion, but it was from an environmental sustainability perspective, carbon reduction, it was very straightforward. So that was straightforward, but it was much, much more complicated around us, as well as our off-taker. We're very interested in understanding DWA's philosophies and DWA's objectives and so on. Since then, we have gone on to do 4 other projects. Today, we've got about just under $10 billion worth of assets that have already been green certified. Very much now look forward to early next year, looking at how we then package them up from a sort of bond perspective.
Thank you. Let me turn to Manish. You did the first green sukuk last year, a hugely successful transaction. Do you want to tell us about the journey? Do you want to tell us how did you align your strategy, your financing strategy to sustainability?
Thank you, John Mark. Good afternoon to everyone. Yes, indeed, it has been an interesting journey. And I call it a journey because when we started the whole issuance, it was a transaction for us. So normally we always keep looking at potential sources of diversifications of funding. And when we had some green assets, we wanted to explore and establish the green credentials in the market. But as both Paulina and Paddy mentioned, when you start speaking to investors about green, there is this sense of a longer-term strategy. They want to see the issuer's credentials. They want to understand the commitment of the company to ESG. So instead of using those assets and doing a transaction, we created a broader sustainability framework. So we worked on an ESG framework. We got all those stakeholders within the company to commit to our ESG goals, our ambitions. We published the ESG framework first. Then, based on the ESG framework, we did the green finance framework. And then we approached the market for a transaction under our overall framework. You know, this allowed us to set the story in place, to set the whole tracking in motion.
So how did, 1 year later, how is your sukuk performing in the market?
Thank you for asking that question. I'm very proud about it. Our green sukuk trades much tighter than our conventional maturities, which shows the appetite that investors have from this region, especially from Saudi, to see green finance transactions come out. We launched that transaction in the middle of COVID last year. We had a 4 times oversubscribed book. We were able to price at a negative new issue premium inside our curve, and we still continue to trade inside our conventional curve.
Fantastic. Maybe I turn to Tim. So we hear CBI label, we hear social, sustainable, green, we hear green sukuk, so many instruments. So how do you navigate all these instruments at Amundi? How do you look at that?
First of all, if I may, Jean-Marc, congratulations, because indeed, the investment banks have played a key role in helping asset managers and issuers to develop sustainable capital markets across the world. And we have now indeed to navigate across different formats, but that's probably due to the fact that there are different needs, different issuer profiles, and different types of appetite coming from investors, institutional investors notably. Maybe to focus on the green bond market, which is by far the largest market in sustainable capital instruments. We're talking about a more than 1 trillion market now. It was facing two challenges, at least according to us. Number one, reaching scale and offering diversification to investors. It was largely started by supranational entities, AAA rated, developed market type of risk profile, and therefore very low yields for investors like us. And gradually, it succeeded in expanding towards blue chip companies first, then sovereigns, then sub-sovereigns. And what key success of this expansion was actually emerging market penetration. That was critical for us because it enables to address the second challenge, actually, which is perhaps even more critical and we should all focus on. It's the question of additionality. Yeah. Additionality for many investors across the world means one thing, is making sure that, of course, besides providing the right level of transparency, having the right quality in terms of underlying assets, the overall program is contributing to decarbonization on the ground. And where does additionality lie? That's the key question. It lies first and foremost for us in emerging markets. And this is why we are all playing, I believe, a critical role in making sustainable capital market meaningful and additional.
May I turn to Paulina? What's your take on this matter?
There are, as you correctly said, Jean-Marc, different flavors of ESG-linked issuers. Ultimately, the type of issuance is related to the type of issuer. If I think about emerging markets, on the sovereign side, it's the social bonds that dominate ESG-linked issuance, followed by green bonds. I don't think there are any sustainability-linked bonds yet on the sovereign side. Whereas on the corporate side, the first bucket would be green bonds, followed by sustainably linked bonds. I think in simple terms, sustainability-linked bonds are focused on what are you achieving, and the greens and social bonds are focused on what are you building. And often, sustainability-linked bonds are better suited for issuers that are hard to abate, sectors like cement, where it's difficult to design a new project which would qualify for green issuance. I also think from the issuer perspective, it's easier, perhaps, to issue a sustainability-linked bond because you don't have to monitor it and to provide as much disclosure, if you will, than you would be with green and sociable issuance. From the investor perspective, the key on SLB bonds for us to ensure that the KPIs are sufficiently aggressive, if you will, and ambitious, and are met in the due time. Recently, we had an issuer that printed an SLB bond with the KPI to be achieved after the bond matures. Clearly, that is not particularly encouraging as a development. I think overall, we're happy to engage in all of those segments of ESG-linked issuance, as long as we believe that the issuance itself supports our positive fundamental view on the ESG risk of the issuer. That's really the underlying theme.
And Tim, let me come back to you. When you are investing in that area, how much do you look at the overall issuers' ESG scores?
It's critical. From Amundi's standpoint, ESG has been really one of the founding pillars of the company and of its growth strategy. And as a result, we took the commitment to integrate ESG in all our actively managed funds. So in our 15 billion plus emerging market investment platform, you will see ESG performance objective embedded into each and every fund. I'm talking about emerging market equity, emerging market debt, local currency, hard currency, and so on and so forth. When it comes to the particular case of green bond, it's critical for two reasons. Number one, we remain credit investors. And indeed, we want to buy a good signature, and ESG risks are critically important, and we need to take that into account. Second, and I think this was one of the points of Paulina's, the starting point can be sometimes lower in emerging market, but what counts is the journey and the direction. And we firmly believe that we can create value if we invest into the issuers with good ESG momentum. So when we analyze the green bonds, it's first issuer level, then green bond program, third underlyings, but we take a dynamic view.
Manish, how do you look at this ESG score and credit rating, ESG rating? How do you align? Is it a focus for you?
Yes, the discussions with the rating agencies have been changing now. Now, you can have your separate ESG rating from the ESG experts, but the conventional mainstream ratings, ESG is playing an important score in your mainstream rating as well. So it's something which adds on to it. So yes, from an investor perspective and an issuer perspective, we would like to have our own separate ESG ratings, and that's a key target. But from an overall conventional ratings perspective, we are having those conversations with the rating agencies where they're asking about our ESG strategies and framework.
Let me change tack for a second and come back to fundamentals. Paddy, if I may, so Vision 2030 has ambitious plans for renewable energy, electricity production, and you're a big part of that. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you. Very ambitious plan. The foundation of it is to get more renewable energy into the system. The specific target to which the country is working is 58.7 gigawatts at a minimum. That means 50% of the grid by 2030. That's the minimum target. And the other important piece is to take oil completely out of power generation. So, I mean, the culmination, the combination of that is very powerful from an emission reduction perspective. Very much on target. There is, an interim target of looking to try and get to 25 gigawatts, which is quite ambitious, by 2023. We're probably going to get very close to it, if not hit it, surprising as it may be. As we sit here in 2021, over 6 gigawatts is already either just under a gigawatt is coming into operation, and another 5 is in construction. Quite a gap now between that and the 2023 target of 25 gigawatts. But I'm very confident we'll probably get very close to it, because there are several projects that are coming up that are big numbers in size. The hydrogen project the green hydrogen project that we are working on, which goes into construction in the first quarter, will itself take 4.5 gigawatts. There'll be another one that follows within a year later, still within this time frame. So there in itself, you're talking about just under 10 gigawatts. So we're very confident that the overall target will be met. I mean, I'm very confident that, this is me, by 2030, we'll be way over 60. I'm willing to put money on something close to 100.
And if I may, I'll be selfish for a moment. Will you consider issuing green bonds to finance all that?
A lot of it will be done with green bonds. I'm very convinced. The important point there with the bonds still has this challenge that you've got to get the asset constructed and then you issue it. Otherwise, it's an extremely, there are some takers who would take it, but it's a very expensive way of financing infrastructure development. So it's better to get conventional financing, green financing, as a bridge to bond. But I'm absolutely sure that a lot of this will get done within the decade on that structure.
So Tim, from the markets, we've seen this year sustainable issuance double in the region, but it's still about 9 billion year to date. So what can we do to really spur growth?
Well, at Amundi, we've tried to take an active approach to capital market developments. And we've been doing so notably through partnerships with public finance institutions to set programs that would take an holistic approach. What we mean by that is that when you want to develop a market, issuer is one thing, there needs to be demand. And very often what happens is that either there is demand but no market, or there is a market but you will fail to meet demand. And green bonds, by the way, why is it a success? It's because it's a bond. It's scalable, it's cost effective, it's an easy fit within institutional investors' allocation. So it's a good instrument, for sure. Then to accelerate market growth, what we try to do is to launch funds that will deploy money over the long run, not being 100% green from the year one, but we give ourselves 5 to 7 years to reach our 100% green target. So we've reached a $1.4 billion fund with the IFC, the first emerging market green bond fund ever. And we've launched similar partnerships with AIB and the likes. But what matters really is not only showing that there is demand, is also being able to provide technical assistance facility in those markets. So we work as well on the side with the World Bank and others to train emerging market bankers, to train issuers, and whenever we can, we explain the rationale behind our appetite for green finance. This, I believe, can play a key role on top of the support from policymakers and local stakeholders.
Yeah, this fund was a first, effectively. Congratulations. Paulina, if I may turn to you on this matter. So the region's wealth is coming for a lot of it from the fossil fuel, effectively. So we're looking at green, we're looking at the transition. How do you reconcile this at Blue Asset Management? How do you look at this?
It is a very important question because on one hand, we as investors understand that if we don't engage with the green issuance to help the economies diversify, then our global target of meeting a lot of ESG objectives, especially the E objective, is not going to be reached. And at the same time, our challenge comes from reconciling the value and the attractiveness that we see in the instrument, be it a green bond or SLB-linked bond, with the issuer's longer-term objectives. And I'll give you an example. This country, in my view, has done an extraordinary job in terms of the pace of transition. And even hearing the speakers in the earlier panel and in our panel, I don't think I can name any other country in emerging markets that has moved at a similar pace. And this is really encouraging and a point that we are quite vocal with our investors and our clients. But then to counter that, what we hear from our clients is the fact that if we look at the targets to, let's say, meet 1.5% degree increase in the global warming. According to the recent statistics, Saudi Arabia ranks among the countries that are critically insufficient in terms of the program set forward in order to deliver the 1.5% target. Now, for us as investors, it's very difficult to reconcile those 2 points. And if we could ask the government's assistance in bringing those 2 objectives closer, and at the very least helping us explain to our clients why, for example, certain statistics come out not as favorably as others, that would make our job and our investments in the country a lot easier and would make the issuers in the country pay much lower rates. So in other words, when we deal with extraction sectors, and I would say that broadly applies to most of emerging markets, we really need the government and the companies' help to reconcile the bottom-up, the issuance, with the medium-term objective of the country in the context of the global ESG framework.
Thank you. And Tim, let me single you out for a second in a positive way, but so you have seen this new framework, the IIGCC, the Institutional Investors Group for Climate Change, just published on about 10 days ago, a new standard for oil and gas in terms of reporting. They worked with several oil and gas companies, Eni, Shell, Total, and a few others, informed by the Transition Pathway Initiative. They set out this standard for net zero transition, plans for the sector. So Amundi is a member of the IIGCC.
That's a mouthful.
Yes. Can you walk us through this, and how do you look at that?
Sure. Indeed, Amundi is a member of the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change, IIGCC. You would find similar regional coalition of investors in the US, that's CRS, as well as in Asia, that's the AIGCC. And what those institutions have done is to accompany the United Nations in their race to net zero, gathering commitment from various players in the financial sector to be carbon neutral or to contribute to carbon neutrality by 2050. And it's very important to understand the magnitude of the commitment. If you look at the Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance, it represents more than 43 trillion US dollars. So it's really significant. It's not only niche, little ESG investors. We are talking about the trillion-plus asset managers as well. If you look at asset owners, it represents more than 7 trillion US dollars. And among those are significant investors into emerging markets. So we believe this is a game changer, for sure, because those institutions are giving themselves targets in absolute terms. It's not anymore in relative terms. I want to beat my benchmark in terms of carbon intensity. I want to be greener than my industry or sector average. Here, they clearly take a public commitment that they will invest into companies, sovereigns, on a net zero path between 2050. So that's a game changer, we believe. Having said that, we have also one conviction, which is that burying our heads in the sand will not help. So we need to remain invested and contribute to the transition of the power sector, of industrials, of transportation, and so on and so forth. So we try, if you wish, Paulina, to address those challenges, those tensions, by remaining invested as much as possible. Divestment is really a last resort option. So to share with everyone, we do not finance coal developers, for instance, because we think it's not compatible with our net zero commitment. For the other sectors, it's an issuer-by-issuer analysis. You need to be very granular. You need to identify the right indicators, and very often it needs to be calibrated at the regional level. Having said that, those carbon neutrality commitments are critical.
if I may, I turn to Paddy. You are a regional champion. How do you see the drive that we can share here towards sustainability in the region?
Well, very, very simply, I mean, it's taking hold very, very fast. In the kingdom and throughout the region, we see it. So a lot of focus is on renewable energy, how quickly renewable energy is being deployed and is penetrating the system. And as I said earlier on, starting to take oil out of the system. But don't underestimate the huge amount of effort that has gone into energy efficiency. Earlier on, it was mentioned. Just the removal or the introduction of the standards for air conditioning, the quality of the air conditioners, banning the cheap and nasty air conditioners, massive saving in power consumption. I mean, Saudi Electric knows how quickly peak capacity is dropped, and it's permanently dropped because it's taken out of the system. So right the way through, from air conditioners to industrial consumption, to lighting, huge savings on efficiency. And then a lot of effort that is also now going, very consciously we see it, in circular economy design thinking, in the new assets that are starting to be developed. So, okay, this is not going to impact tomorrow, but it will have a significant impact in decade spanning beyond then subsequent decades. Significant amount of work is going into research and development, innovation, KAUST, KAUST, all the Aramco's, SABIC, even we are involved in serious innovation, inventions, not theoretical, practical applications to increase efficiency, reduce carbon emissions, and improve performance. So all aspects right across. And the last one is, a lot of discussion is around, okay, so we want ESG qualification to get the money, because then we kind of widen the pool of liquidity that we can attract. Perfect. What we have found from the earliest days, every aspect of that E and the S and the G, it's all about improving corporate performance. You know, people say, oh, ESG, you know, does it reduce the cost of financing? Well, whether it does or not, it must. For a very simple reason, a business that truly complies and adheres to and is able to measure and improve is reducing its own risk. It is able, more likely to pay back and service that debt. And we see it. I mean, from the earliest days, even before ESG was coined, we were pouring effort into social development around the plants that we were building. Not because we wanted to feel good, we were protecting our own money. No amount of guard dogs or barbed wires were going to protect these plants in the middle of nowhere for 25 years. So it was about making sure that you did the right thing, but it turns out it's fantastic for the community at large as well. So you kind of develop the community. So every aspect, whether corporate governance, disclosures, the biggest risk mitigant is just put it out there. Whatever you're doing, somebody else will pick up the mistake then. So if you kind of look through every piece of the E and the S and the G, you will find that it's actually a value adder to the business. And that, I think, is now getting across to many, many businesses in this part of the world and across the world.
Manish, do you want to add to that? I mean, what's your advice to companies looking at these matters and looking maybe to access the market as well?
So in terms of strategy, again, this is not a one-time affair with the market. This is a longer-term commitment with the market. And from an issuer perspective, you want to be out there regularly, irrespective if you are tapping the markets or not. You need to keep your focus on the ESG strategy, keep updating it, keep it rated, be in the market from an ESG perspective. Link the overall performance of the company to the ESG focus. And that's where we see the real appetite of investors coming in, believing in the issuer, believing in the story. Also, there's a fair bit of communication needed, because in my experience of speaking to investors over the last 5-6 years, the pace of change in the kingdom is so fast that their global models don't incorporate how fast we are changing here. And so I'll just give you some examples. In terms of smart meters, we have implemented smart meters in less than a year for all of the kingdom's customers, more than 10 million smart meters. Never ever it has been done at this pace globally. We look at the other changes on the renewable energy, the ambitions. This is unheard of pace at which the kingdom is moving. So in terms of communication, extremely important to keep those open channels of communication with the investors, to really allow them to understand the pace of change at which the companies here are operating.
Tim, if I may single Amundi again. So Amundi was a founding signatory of the Principles for Responsible Investment, or PRI, since their creation in 2006, committing to integrate ESG in your investment process. So the PRI signatories is now more than 3,000 owners and probably $100 trillion under management. So this was voluntary then. Now the EU SFDR is coming online. How is Amundi doing?
They keep ourselves busy. But to be fair with you and transparent, we believe that here again, we have a game changer, not only for EU financial sector, but actually at the global level. When you try to analyze what are the key drivers behind ESG growth, you have ESG materiality that have been said. You have as well, of course, values and appetite for a more sustainable world. That's what governments are aiming for, as well as the end consumers of saving product. But there is a third driver, which is the focus by policymakers on the financial sector and how they can contribute to sustainable development financing goals. We've seen that in China in 2015, and we're seeing that nowadays in the EU with a very powerful comprehensive plan, because there is one piece of regulation, which is SFDR. You have to classify or categorize all the financial products that you sell in 3 categories: non-ESG, ESG, and financial product with a sustainable investment objective, so leaning towards impact. But there are other pieces in the legislation which are making it powerful. You have the Corporate Reporting Directive, NFRD and CSRD. So within the EU, all the companies will have to increase tremendously their level of ESG reporting. And we're talking about 50,000 companies, not only the listed one and the very large players. So that increased the bar in terms of expectation from international investors. And then you have the delegated act on MiFID. All the financial advisors selling financial products will need to take into account the sustainable preferences of the end savers. Once again, a game changer, because we need to position the right product in front of the right sustainability preferences. And last but not least, taxonomy. They are developing a definition of what green means within the EU. So I was talking about potential extraterritoriality. It's because of very different reasons, but number one, it's a key financial center. So all the non-EU players active in the EU have to take into account those rules. All the issuers who want to get financed by EU players one way or another will be impacted. And we see also a lot of policymakers being inspired by the EU, not to say that they will do the same, but it's becoming a benchmark. So we're having discussion on taxonomy in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Japan, and in many, many jurisdictions.
maybe Paulina, Blue Bay was a signatory to the PRI back in 2013, I think. As a global asset manager, how do you navigate all those different regulations? We just talk about the EU taxonomy. Is it possibly offering harmonization? I always think of the GDPR, and now we are talking about the SFDR, offering kind of a light for global light, if you will. How do you look at this relative lack of global standards, despite this one? How does it work for Blue Bay Asset Management?
Thank you, and you're absolutely right. It is often a confusing topic because there is no consistency. And if you think about the requirements, even within Europe, you have different approaches. You have French regulator that is more focused on best-in-class approach when it comes to ESG. You have some of the Nordic countries that actually feel more comfortable with the exclusion list. For example, they have a strong view on the countries that are not signatories of UN Global Compact. And as a manager, you have to combine all those push factors, if you will, from regulators, but also you have to bring in the pull factors from your investor base and what makes your investors want to invest in your funds. And even here, there is a lot of differentiation. Retail investors are actually more engaged on the ESG side and ESG-linked products. Institutional investors are more driven often by the regulators and by the consultants. So again, a lot of different factors. For us, the best way to address it is to have our own framework, our own ESG assessment, which is done in-house within the investment team as part of our fundamental analysis. And I think we would all agree that ESG analysis is not new. It's has been with us as long as we've been bottom-up investors. The main difference, I would say, over the last 5 to 10 years has been the role of risk, environmental risk, which has become a lot more prominent. But for us, the role is to have our own framework, make sure we are aware of all the other third-party providers that all have an ESG scoring, because often, even unbeknownst to us, our funds are screened by different third-party providers, and that impacts investors' involvement with us. But most importantly, be credible when it comes to explaining our framework, be transparent, and really link it to the broader goals that are set by the regulators, but also the incentives for us as investors in emerging markets. When it comes to taxonomy, I do think that the concept is quite positive, and it focuses, as Tim said, on setting a common framework, in simple terms, for sectors that are good for us and those that are not, and they're harmful. The challenge is, in some sectors, it's black and white. For example, electric vehicles or renewable energy. In other sectors, it's not. For example, nuclear power, positive from the environmental standpoint when it comes to carbon emissions, not so positive from a health and safety perspective, from the operational risk. And even though we already have a 500-page document on the matter, the EU taxonomy is far from being closed as a subject, because every single country brings their own perspective to that. So it is a complex subject. It is here to stay. And I think it's really the consistency in approach that will differentiate us as investors, both within our own framework, but also constantly being in contact with the broader environment to understand how the standards are changing as we're moving along. And like Tim has mentioned, even the new FSDR rule and the introduction of Article 6, 8, and 9 funds, again, this is another push factor. It's a factor to disclose your approach, but we are all moving to the new framework, because I think if you apply the old framework, you will quickly lose your edge as investor in emerging markets.
No, thanks, Paulina. to manage from here in Riyadh, how do you look at the EU taxonomy? Is it helpful to issuers? How do you look at that?
I think this point was also touched in the previous panel in terms of the problem of convergence. So when we look at things from an issuer perspective, there are many different regulations out there, guidelines out there, principles out there that we need to take into consideration when we are developing a framework. So the EU framework helps because it lists down clear guidelines, in terms of the broad 6 objectives that EU taxonomy has. So it gives that framework. But again, for an issuer who's not there, we need to find a way into how we interpret those principles locally and how we apply them locally, because we will be tapping into that market for investors and given the connections that the global financial markets has. So, it is an important perspective from an issuer side that we need to take into consideration the EU taxonomy. But from our perspective, it has to be from a more local perspective. The interpretation needs to be local, so that's something that we can adhere to and something that we can follow. Also, similarly, as we mentioned, there are so many other governments who are working on similar frameworks. You have Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, United Kingdom, Canada. So again, we as an issuer would definitely feel much more comfortable if there is a standard set of regulations that we have to follow from emerging market perspective.
If I may add one point, I fully agree. It's becoming a challenge from an investor standpoint and from an issuer standpoint, right? Because you're meeting several investors with several requirements. And I'm not quite sure, I think it's a great aspiration, but I'm not quite sure we'll have a single standard out there for all issuers, all investors. But one way to address that is to have science-based targets and analysis. And we see this coming more and more. And then, of course, the results are always debatable. But if you are fully transparent and science-based in your approach when it comes to carbon path, that can help a lot.
And on the same path, maybe for Paddy, but also Manish potentially, according to the structured, Sustainable Finance and Investing Survey from HSBC, one of the main problems for investors is to assess whether projects are truly sustainable. I'm talking infrastructure here. So is it something the infrastructure sector is talking to each other about to try to find a way to have a label system so that for investors it's pretty clear what is and what is not? Are you working on that as a sector?
Look, I think we have spent quite a bit of time with people like Sustainalytics, Big Air, all the different 4 or 5 that we've been working with, trying to find a way of equating it. But I think what Tim mentioned is probably the way forward. Coming up with some technology-based, science-based, defendable criteria. It's very easy when it comes to renewable energy. It's going to be very easy when I turn to green hydrogen. It's going to be it's a lot more. So for me, I'm safe. Aquapower. But we started to face a challenge already on desalination. We are very heavily involved in desalination. We have managed, with a lot of advisory input, to get Tawila green certified. But it was quite an interesting exercise because we found we were discovering, we were inventing new sort of standardization criteria. So yes, we are very actively involved, but it seems to be something that we're going to have to go asset by asset or infrastructure piece by infrastructure piece, road, airport, it's a nightmare. So I think there must be some sort of science applied to it that equates the platform. We're quite a long way from there.
From my perspective, again, based on the comments of the fellow panelists, we need a scientific approach that will make life easier for all of us. What we have done, we have won with multiple agencies over the years to create a principles, broad set of principles for us, to make it easier for us, to communicate it with the strategy teams, with the financial teams, as to what would qualify under the framework. So we have to do that education that we have been doing over the years now to understand what qualifies and what does not. And principles, the way it is written today, they give a lot of flexibility in terms of how you want to demonstrate compliance to those principles. Again, some quantitative mathematical approach will help. So looking forward, we would like to see developments happening in that area where it's easier for us to classify projects.
Well, I have a question for all of you, but maybe I'll start with Tim. A majority of the 1,000 investors interviewed for this survey said it's important for companies to invest in preparing for the effects of climate change. So the question I have is, do you think this current wave will increase the cost of financing or possibly shut down access to capital for some companies? Maybe Tim, you start.
Well, if you take the global market, and this would be the largest pool, if you want, of available money beyond banks, there is a clear trend to take into account ESG criteria. Not all investors have very significant exclusion criteria within their responsible investment policy, but it's expanding. So you will end up in a situation where some industries have a hard time to tap capital markets involving very significant institutional investors. So look at the tobacco, for instance. Very, very significant portion of institutional investors have actually excluded tobacco altogether from their portfolios. I think in terms of thermal coal, we are getting there. At a Amundi level, for all our portfolio, except for some passively managed product, we basically exclude all coal developers, as I said, and we have very tight thresholds in terms of maintaining your exposure. And of course, then we differentiate between OECD country and the other part of the world, but this is something issuers need to take into account for sure. And the result is that they will not probably, they will still be able to get some financing, but it should have an impact on the cost. That's a given.
Before I turn to the issuers, Paulina, do you want to comment?
I would agree that the current framework going forward on ESG would make a lot more differentiation within the cost of funding for the issuers. And like Tim has mentioned, we as well have already excluded the thermal coal as one of the sector from investment opportunities. But it's our least preferred option, because by excluding something, we're not necessarily achieving any longer-term ESG targets. So our focus would always be on engaging to see if we can find an improving trend in the issuers, and we can deliver that to the clients. And the second point that I would make is, while we live and breathe emerging markets, let's not forget that global client allocation to emerging market fixed income is at most 5% of investors' portfolios. And most developed market clients don't have to buy emerging market fixed income. Therefore, the tolerance for explanations and justifications for our clients often is much lower than for us. And that's where, if I could address the audience, the more help we get from you on getting more transparency in the numbers, on justifying that scientifically, as Tim has mentioned, the improvements that we're seeing in the country, the easier it is for us to convince investors to jump on board with us and to increase our investment in the region. I would go further by saying that in today's market, this region, and Saudi is a very big part of this, is, in my view, in a region where all the stars are aligned. In the high inflation, high uncertain world, the sector that is improving ESG strengths is a commodity exporter, but at the same time still has very strong fundamental matrix, is an area where investors want to put their money, but they need more confirmation, especially on the ESG side, that those targets that the kingdom and other countries are putting forward are credible, and hence they don't have to answer to their board why they're making allocations to certain part of emerging markets. So it's all about engagement and more transparency in the targets and the delivery on those.
So Manish, I turn to you for, I'm conscious of time, but you benefited from greenium, as we call it, right? So you benefited from having a green sukuk that priced well and performs well. Do you think that's a lesson for other issuers in terms of focusing on this matter to have better pricing, and maybe talking to Paulina, transition for others who may get shut down by the market?
Yeah. So in terms of the issuance, yes, there are benefits of doing issuance. Because of the amount of money that is chasing ESG today, green funds have those allocations. So in terms of banks also, there are ESG targets announced by all financial institutions. So there's a lot of funds being chased here. So it's easier to get a good price transaction out there. But that should not be the goal of the issuer. That is not the objective. The objective should be how to use ESG for better financial performance and social performance. So financing is not the goal to do ESG.
Yeah, sorry. So the green loan certification on the Noor Energy project, the 4.5 billion, absolutely for sure reduced the cost of that project finance. We found it in every successive green certification we have done for a very simple reason, exactly like what Manish is pointing out. Basically, that allows us to widen access to funds. The pool of liquidity widens. And I think there is a recognition that the risk is lower as a result of good governance and social responsibility and environmental stewardship. But for us, it's exactly the same. As a company, it allows us, it keeps us on check, pushes us to perform better.
Maybe we have time for one or two questions from the audience. We're over time, so no questions? Well, let me thank my panelists. We kill everybody. Look, thank you very much, my distinguished panelists. Thank you for coming to Riyadh, and thanks for joining us on the panel. I'm sure this is an ongoing subject, and we look forward to see you next year with the FSC in 2022. So again, thank you.
Thank you very much to our respected speakers for a very superb panel discussion, which is actually our final one for today. To conclude today's event, we will hear some insightful remarks from His Excellency the Finance Minister of Saudi Arabia, Mr. Mohammed Al-Jad'an. Delivering it on his behalf, please welcome on the stage Mr. Abdulaziz Al-Rashid, the Assistant Minister for Macro-Physical Policies and International Affairs. Your Excellency, if you would, please.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. مساكم الله بالخير جميعا، وحياكم الله في النسخة الأولى من حوارات مؤتمر القطاع المالي. يشرفني طبعا أن ألقي كلمة معالي الوزير اليوم أمامكم، وبحكم أن الحدث كله يدار باللغة الإنجليزية فإذنوا لي أن أتحول للغة الإنجليزية. It is my honor and privilege to deliver His Excellency's the Finance Minister concluding remarks today. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, I am tremendously honored and delighted to deliver the concluding remarks for the first edition of the Financial Sector Conference Talks. Firstly, I would like to thank all the keynote speakers, panelists, moderators, and those in the audience for their valuable insights, contributions, and discussions on a topic that is not only important to the Kingdom, but also to the global community. Efforts towards sustainability has been on the forefront of the Kingdom's Vision 2030 policy agenda for the past several years. And as a result, we have looked at the topic holistically. What I mean by holistically is that the Kingdom did not only tackle the sustainability topic directly, i.e. our commitments in terms of the Paris Agreement on the global reduction of greenhouse gases, but also indirectly through, for example, our financial markets. We believe that the financial sector is a key enabler to support the Kingdom's efforts towards achieving our sustainability goals. Today, I speak to you on my capacity as the chairman of the Financial Sector Development Program, one of the Kingdom's vision realization programs, and I am pleased to say that we have reviewed our strategy and commitments to now include sustainability as a core objective while developing our robust financial system. We have launched an initiative called ESG and Sustainable Finance in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with the aim of providing our financial sector with the necessary tools to enable and broaden the Kingdom's capabilities in sustainable financing and investing. This is only the tip of the iceberg under FSDB, which is the Financial Sector Development Program. Our commitments towards sustainable finance are ever growing, and this successful conference acts as another key step on our sustainable finance transformation journey. As all of you may have read or heard, various sustainable finance activities have already started to hit headlines in the Kingdom and internationally. We have seen the eagerness and commitment of various government organizations to launching green bonds. We have also seen publicly listed companies on the Tadawul Stock Exchange putting ESG in the forefront of their strategy. Examples from the private sector include the Saudi Electric Company issuance of a $1.3 billion dual tranche international green sukuk, which was 4 times subscribed and priced 10 and 15 basis points inside the company's yield curve for the 5 and 10-year tranches, respectively. In the public sector, over a year ago, the Kingdom made its ESG-linked financing debut in July 2020 with a deal size worth more than $250 million for the purchase of public transportation buses. The Kingdom also hired leading knowledge houses and advisory firms to build our ESG framework. In addition, the Public Investment Fund hired 5 advisors for its medium-term capital raising strategy. Work has also started on the launching of an ESG index in our local capital market by Tadawul, and many more activities in the sustainable finance sphere in the Kingdom. I sincerely welcome you to join our efforts at the Financial Sector Development Program, alongside the program's valuable partners, the Ministry of Finance, the Saudi Central Bank, and the Capital Market Authority, and the National Debt Management Center, in spearheading the development of sustainable finance ecosystem in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The structuring of Saudi Arabia's sustainability financing framework is a strategic step in line with the Kingdom's Vision 2030 direction towards sustainability and ESG commitment. As recently announced, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince launched Green Saudi Initiative and Green Middle East Initiative that clearly demonstrate the roadmap to environment preservation, and further details will be announced in due course soon. Renewable energy provision is also at the heart of the Giga projects. Energy requirements, efficiency, and efficacy driven by technology application which attract sustainable funding is an illustration of this. As an illustration of this, the Red Sea Development Company secures more than 14 billion Saudi riyals loan and first ever Riyal-dominated green finance credit facility. We have also applied innovative sustainable financing techniques to the build environment, where, for example, we do not pay companies to replace outdated lighting and air conditioning units in our schools, hospitals, and government buildings, but share a percentage of the energy savings. We are aware, though, that much remains to be done. The government is determined to redouble its efforts to deliver on promises and actions it has announced. We are committed to working fully with governments and businesses from around the world to provide a more sustainable economy for ourselves, our future generations, and the world at large, firmly based on ESG and sustainable-based financing. Saudi Arabia is determined to walk the talk, I would say even to run the talk. I look forward to welcoming you all back next year in February 2020 for the second edition of the Financial Sector Conference, which promises to be more successful than our first edition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and to the distinguished speakers and guests. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you all with us today in this concentrated event, which hopefully, as His Excellency has mentioned, will be the first of many more to come relevant to the financial sector conferences in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Thank you once again, and see you soon next year.